What we're going to learn in today's video is going to demolish all of our former end-time theories. Wait till you see. Jesus' robe, you see, is dipped with blood before he rides out to fight Armageddon. When Jesus rides that white horse out of heaven in Revelation 19 and returns to fight Armageddon, his garments are already dipped in blood. Let's see the passage. Now I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on him was called Faithful and True. That's Jesus, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and on his head were many crowns. He had a name written that no one knew except himself. He was clothed with a robe dipped in blood. There's the passage. And his name is called the Word of God. Now, how was his robe dipped in blood before Armageddon, before he fights that war? Why was the blood soaked when he was still in heaven? That's what it's saying. The knee-jerk answer to this question, of course, is that the blood is Jesus' blood shed on the cross. However, think about how impossible that is. In John 19:23, we learn that Jesus was stripped by the soldiers of his earthly clothing. They divided his garments and gambled for his tunic, as was prophesied in Psalm 22. Then Jesus was placed in a tomb, covered with a linen cloth and a head covering. But these two items were left behind in the tomb. So all earthly garments that could have been blood-soaked were left behind at the resurrection. And immediately after that resurrection, Jesus was seen by Mary Magdalene. Notice something interesting here. Now, when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, and did not know it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." And she turned and said to him, "Rabboni," which is to say, teacher. John 20:14 through 16. This pretty much proves Jesus was wearing something. He was wearing a garment of some sort, or Mary would have been offended. I mean, pretty obvious. But if Jesus was wearing a blood-soaked garment, there was no way that Mary would have thought he was the gardener. No, this proves Jesus was wearing a heavenly garment at that point in time, and one that was not blood-soaked. The same is true of the two of Jesus' followers on the road to Emmaus later that day, as recorded in Luke 24. They encountered Jesus and didn't know it was him. They also have dinner with him. Certainly, if his garments were soaked in blood, this would have been a topic of discussion, right? Yeah, but it wasn't. The same can also be said of all of Jesus' encounters with his disciples. There is zero discussion of Jesus wearing blood-soaked garments at any point. It's also inconceivable that Jesus would wear dirty, bloody garments into the heavenly Holy of Holies. For Christ has not entered the holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. And by that it means as our high priest. He's going to wear high priestly garments. So for all these reasons, it is just abundantly clear that Jesus' garments were not blood-soaked after he arose from the grave and was given heavenly garments. Although he still has scars, one on the cross, he doesn't have those old garments. So the blood on Jesus' garments, when he mounts the white horse, is not his blood. It's someone else's. Is there blood in heaven? Could he have stained his garments there? It's highly unlikely. In heaven, we have either angels, cherubim, or humans in resurrection bodies. Bleeding doesn't seem possible. That leaves only one solution. It is the blood of Jesus' earthly enemies that is on his robe. And this creates an incredible problem for every single end-time theory, every single eschatology. When was Jesus on earth, where he could have dipped his robes in the blood of his enemies. Isn't it the second coming? When Jesus rides that white horse, the first time that he touches the earth after he ascended? That's what I hear from pre-trib, pre-wrath, amillennialism, post-trib. That's what everybody believes. Well, this is what you'll learn in seminaries and from most end-time scholars, but it appears there might have been another time that Jesus' feet touched the earth prior to the time he rode his white horse, what most call the second coming. So if the blood on Jesus' robe blasts all of our eschatology to bits, we should think about revising our end-time teaching. But it's going to take a lot more evidence than just saying Jesus dipped his robes in blood on the earth. I'm sure you want to see proof of this. And there is a passage in Isaiah that is crystal clear on this subject. Here it is. Who is this who comes from Edom with dyed garments from Basra? This one, who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength. I, who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. And that's Jesus' quote. And Isaiah asks him a question. Why is your apparel red and your garments like one who treads a winepress? Jesus answers, I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. For I have trodden them in my anger and trampled them in my fury. Their blood sprinkled upon my garments, and I stained all my robes. There's the answer. There is the answer to our mystery. Jesus was walking on the earth from Edom and Basra with garments stained with the blood of his enemies. Jesus tells us that this is how his garments were stained. He doesn't say some of the blood was his, and later he added some of his enemies' blood. He says it's all theirs. And what is incredible is Jesus was doing this prior to the second coming, or what most scholars consider the second coming, when he rides a white horse, because his robe is already dipped in blood. As we said, this demolishes all eschatology and all end-time theories out there, every single one. And what it says is that there is a second coming before the second coming everybody anticipates is in Revelation 19. So, when was Jesus on the earth to do this? When was he walking on the earth prior to the second coming? The answer is at the rapture. It is the only possibility. Let's see what Isaiah 63 says about this. I have trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one was with me. For I have trodden them in my anger and trampled them in my fury, that's his wrath. Their blood is sprinkled upon my garments, and I have stained all my robes, because the day of vengeance was in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come, or had started at that point. And he specifically answers that this event occurs when he is treading the winepress. So let's look at a couple places and find where that winepress might be mentioned. We see this in Revelation. Then I looked, and behold a white cloud, and on the cloud sat one like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, who is Jesus, Thrust in your sickle and reap, for the time has come for you to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. So he who sat on the cloud thrust his sickle on the earth, and the earth was reaped. That's the resurrection and rapture. Then another angel came out of the temple, which is in heaven, also having a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, who had the power over fire. And he cried with a loud cry to him who had the sharp sickle, saying, thrust in your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of the vine of the earth, for her grapes are fully ripe. So the angel thrust his sickle onto the earth and gathered the vines of the earth, the unrighteous, the unrepentant, and threw them into the winepress of the wrath of God. Revelation 14 through 19. When Jesus comes on the clouds, he harvests the earth. This is the resurrection and rapture. Right after that, the unrighteous are thrown in the winepress. This is the event in Isaiah 63. Jesus is on the earth at that point. The prophet Joel also discusses this winepress. Let's look at that. Let the nations be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, for there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Notice surrounding nations, the ones in the Middle East. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come, go down, for the winepress, there it is full. The vats overflow. For their wickedness is great, multitudes, multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. Is near. That means it hasn't happened yet at that point. Very interesting verse. And in this verse, Jesus is sitting in judgment in the valley of decision, the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is 11 miles east of Jerusalem. This is where Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, annihilated the Gentile coalition of Moab, Ammon, and Edom, situated in the Judean desert. It's in the proximity of a town named Tugu. And notice that Jehoshaphat defeated this same group, Edom, Moab, and the Ammonites at this site. So the valley of Jehoshaphat seems a very appropriate place for Jesus to be sitting in judgment. And Jesus tells us exactly when he comes back to earth. Let's stop right there. This is like we should be waving flags. We should be concentrating on this. This is like a super important point. Don't you want to know where in the scope of the 70th week of Daniel does Jesus return? Is it at the beginning, middle, somewhere near the end, or at the end? Jesus is going to tell us exactly when he comes back to earth prior to riding that white horse. So put the white horse at the end. Where does he come back? Where he's going to tread the winepress, where he's going to be on the earth. It is on the day of his vengeance, the day of the Lord. It says that in Joel. It says that in Isaiah. It is on the day of his vengeance, the day of the Lord. After this, Jesus tells us through Isaiah the prophet that there is a year's time period after that. So there is a year from the rapture to the time when Jesus rides that white horse. Does this mean Jesus comes back 2 times? Yes, it does. It may even mean that he comes back more than 2 times. I know this sounds like crazy talk, but Jesus comes back at least 2 times that year. The fact that his robe is already dipped in blood when he rides the white horse shows us that. This is different than anyone has thought. Remember, it has to be prior to Jesus leaving heaven on a white horse, because the Lord's robe is already stained with blood. And that's the whole point. This verse in Isaiah 63 also seems to show us how much sooner that first coming is. A year sooner. A year when Jesus redeems Israel. It's the year of his redeemed. Let's keep looking at this to see what else happens in that year. There are 2 other verses about this year in Isaiah. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom. There's Edom again. For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance. There's that. Day of the Lord's vengeance, day of the Lord again. The year of recompense for the cause of Zion. Edom is mentioned again in this passage, as is the day of the Lord's vengeance. and a year is mentioned also. So these are all the same things we saw in Isaiah 63. But here, in Isaiah 34, the year is said to be a year of recompense or payback for the cause of Zion, for what Edom did to Zion, to Israel. So in addition to redeeming Israel during this year, Jesus also plans to pour out his wrath in that year on Israel's enemies. And there is a third reference as well, a very, very familiar one. You're going to know this passage. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prisons for those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn. Now, I said this passage is familiar. I'm positive you have probably heard it before, because Jesus quotes this in the synagogue in Nazareth at the beginning of his ministry. But he did not include the part of the passage about the day of vengeance, because during his first coming, the only vengeance would fall on him on the cross. However, at his second coming, it falls on the unrepentant. In this passage, the year time period is given a third meaning. Remember, we already had a year of recompense, we had a year of his redeemed, and now we have a third meaning. In addition to what we had talked about before, it will also be the acceptable year of the Lord. But what does that mean, acceptable? What is acceptable all about, or better yet, who is acceptable? The word acceptable in Hebrew is ratzon. It is the same word written on the golden headband of the high priest, who would wear it when he entered the Holy of Holies. And he would stand then before the Ark of the Covenant and the presence of God himself. The words were acceptable to Yahweh. The high priest was able to enter the Lord's presence because he was acceptable. And this word carries that same meaning in Isaiah 61. But here, it is believers who are made acceptable for a year's time period. How is that? Remember, this is the day of the Lord. It's the day of the rapture. It is a moment when believers are carried into heaven and made acceptable to enter the presence of God the Father and come before his throne. So it is a year when believers will be able to be before the throne of the Father, as we see in Revelation 7. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with a white robe, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. So believers then are acceptable to stand before the throne of the Father during that 1 year period of time. So the year prior to the end of the 70th week of Daniel, the 7th year of that 70th week is a year of recompense, redemption, and for Christians, it's a year when they are acceptable before the Father in heaven. And for those not familiar with Hebraic calendars, you probably don't know that the 7th year of all 7-year weeks, because all of time is divided into these 7-year segments, that year, that final year, that 7th year is set aside as different from all of the other 6. It's called a Shemitah year. You may have heard that term. And the Shemitah year, prior to a Jubilee, is even more special. And believe it or not, this final year of the 70th week that we've been talking about is related to Noah's flood. How? You might say, how could that be possible? There weren't even Shemitah years at that time. Well, you're going to find out. Click right here to keep watching and see how God painted a picture of the final wrath of God in the first flood, the first wrath, and how it related to this 1 year period. Till then, this is Nelson. and I'll see you there.